Thank you for attending this presentation. I will talk about the impact of land management on greenhouse gas emissions. I will present a little bit of background and what current research there is showing opportunities for mitigating emissions. Carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are the main greenhouse gases that are increasing in the last 100 years and continue to increase as product of anthropogenic activities. In agricultural systems, the application of synthetic fertilizer as well as organic fertilizer that is recycled to soil both produce nitrous oxide emissions directly, but also indirect emissions occur as a result of ammonia, nitric oxide, and also nitrate that result in further nitrous oxide emissions. From the carbon point of view, methane is produced from enteric fermentation, but also from manure management, and carbon dioxide is produced from the application of urea and liming soil. As shown in this slide, these are the sources that are listed by the IPCC, but are relevant to UK agriculture. And as you can see, most of them generate N2O. Enteric fermentation and manure management also generate methane. And as I mentioned earlier, urea and liming generate carbon dioxide. At national level, about 60% of emissions are from methane, another 35% are from nitrous oxide, and the rest is CO2. Looking in detail at the nitrous oxide emissions, we can see that the majority of emissions, or the biggest source, is in organic fertilizer, but also there are important sources in organic nitrogen, crop residues, cultivation of organic soils, and from nitrate leaching and runoff. It is important to consider the spatial disaggregation of the emissions. In this case, I show the maps with the N2O emissions in the UK, showing that most of the places are source of N2O, except for Scotland. And this is mostly due to the fact that, as I said earlier, fertilizer is an important source. In the case of methane, the largest sources are on the west side of the UK, and this is because it's related to the livestock sector. This is quite relevant when deciding about application of mitigation strategies, as the selection of strategies must be according to the practices. What factors affect emissions? There are various factors that individually affect emissions, but also interact with other factors. For example, the climate, soil microbes, chemical compounds released by root exudates, but also physical factors such as compaction, temperature, etc. Overall, and overarching these factors, there is the management, particularly the management of fertilizer, grazing, management of the crop, management of the soil, and the management should be considered carefully because it's probably the best option that can be manipulated in order to mitigate emissions. In the case of fertilizer, this graph shows how the increase in fertilizer rates for 5 different locations in the UK result in increased emissions of nitrous oxide. As you can see, the effect is different for different sites. suggesting that optimizing rates of nitrogen should be considered as one of the most effective measures, but also recycling manure and using legumes. And here I mentioned the use of nitrification inhibitors, which in this second graph, as you can see, this is emission factors for nitrous oxide as a result of urine deposition in soil in one location. And this urine was deposited either in the spring, in the summer, or in the autumn. The left-hand side shows how emission factors in the spring were much higher, but also when applying a nitrification inhibitor such as DCD, the graph on the right-hand side shows a decrease in emissions, but this is more significant for the spring application and not so much for the summer and the autumn. So it is important to also consider the time of the year when deciding on mitigation strategies. Following on fertilizer, I show here some results of emissions for 5 sites where the same rate of application, 320 kilograms per hectare, was applied as in different forms. In the first bar, the blue, the dark blue, shows the emission for ammonium nitrate application, which when applied with a nitrification inhibitor in orange, we can see a decrease in emissions, but not in all sites. So Drayton, for example, didn't show a decrease, neither did Hillsborough. In the case of urea in gray, when applying nitrification inhibitor in yellow was effective in all cases, as you can see. However, when comparing urea versus ammonium nitrate, we can see a decrease in emission also in all sites, but less significant in, for example, in Hillsborough. The last measure was splitting the application, the 320 kilos split into different doses. So the light blue, the last bar of the graph, shows the resulting emission for the year. And as you can see, compared to the full application in one dose, in the case of Crichton, there was an increase in emissions. And in Northwick, there was a decrease, but the other sites did not show a significant change. So again, the application of the same mitigation measure changed depending on location. In terms of the cultivation method, the graph here shows emissions for the ratio of not tilled to tilled cultivation method. And it is believed that not tilled soil will produce different emissions compared to the tilled soil. In this case, we see that the ratio changes depending on the aeration status of the soil. So when the soil is poorly aerated, the non-till to till emissions are much higher. When the soil is well aerated, the non-till to till emissions are lower and below 1. Also, looking at the method of application of manures, in this case, digestate applied as broadcast or as band spread didn't seem to make a difference in this particular location, whereas in the case of the cattle slurry, there was an increase in emissions when the slurry was applied as a band spread. Emissions were lower from farmyard manure and green compost, but the results changed also with the location. So there is no consistency in the results. In the case of pasture management, I show here a graph of emissions from the farm platform, Rothamsted, where Festulolium in orange show much higher emissions after fertilizer application compared to the Festulolium with the white clover. The white clover mixed sort had a little bit of fertilizer too, but obviously less than the Festulolium, but obviously emissions are mitigated when clover is introduced in the system. The introduction of clover is also believed to improve enteric methane production from cattle and from livestock in general. In this case, we see that methane emissions from grass versus grass with clover was higher, but the difference between the two was not significant. We are, however, continuing these measurements this year because it will be interesting to know if there is a difference year to year, for example. Grazing causes soil compaction. Emissions measured in the laboratory on the compacted soil, as you can see here in black, show much bigger emissions of nitrous oxide compared to the red curve, which is the uncompacted soil. This figure shows a field of the farm platform in which the cows were fitted with GPS sensors to track their movement, and it shows in a week how the grazing behavior preferentially uses some areas of the field. This is the kind of information that could be useful to manage grazing and to decrease and to manipulate the effect of compaction. We are investigating the effect of compaction in these two different grazing management regimes. On the left-hand side, we have a set stocking management in which the animals are placed in bigger areas and left to graze freely. On the right-hand side, we put the animals in confined areas for shorter periods, and the animals get moved frequently. It's hypothesized that the grazing behavior on the cell grazing treatment will produce more compaction than in the set stocking. So we have done 2 campaigns already to look into this. And finally, in terms of line management, the introduction of trees in grazing systems could be a way to improve carbon sequestration, to stabilize carbon in soil, as well as obviously improve the animal welfare. So Rothamsted, Northwick has set up a trial as part of a network of farms in Devon to assess the effect of introducing silvopasture into grassland systems. In summary, the mitigation options include managing fertilizer, the pasture, the cultivation, and the grazing. Intervention should be prioritized considering the location, also the soil type, locating the right crop, the right soil, the right climate, and all pollutants should be assessed. Finally, thank you, and I will be happy to answer questions.